Today we're going to reread our book about George Washington to think about more details about his life. Later, I'm going to ask you to draw and write about what you like best about him as a leader, so think about that as I read. We know that George Washington was our very first president, and the president is the leader of our country. As I read today, I want you to listen for the word leader and raise your hand when you hear it. We'll think about the times in George's life when people called him a leader. Remember, raise your hand when you hear the word leader. It was a cold winter morning on February 22nd, 1732. This was more than 200 years ago. Inside a Virginia farmhouse, where it was warm and cozy, a special baby boy was born. The baby's name was George Washington. As little George grew up, he loved the farm and all of the animals. He loved his horse best of all. George had 2 older brothers who lived away. He lived with a younger sister and 3 younger brothers. They followed George's every move. "Let's play follow the leader," said Betty. "George is the leader," said John. Samuel and Charles agreed. So even when George was a young boy, the children thought of him as a leader. George went to a small country school. He worked very hard. He was one of the smartest students. George was also the most honest boy in school. He grew up very fast. He was bigger and taller than all of the other boys. Everyone looked up to George. Sometimes George would choose games for his classmates to play. "George is a natural-born leader," his schoolmaster would say. George would choose games, and his classmates would call him a natural-born leader. So I think that even at a young age, people looked up to George and thought he made a good leader. He had already begun to develop skills he needed to be a good president. In school, George liked to read and to write. He liked numbers, but he liked to make maps and measure land best of all. This is called surveying. George practiced by measuring the vegetable gardens on his farm. Many farmers wanted George to survey their land. It would help them to know how much seed to buy when it was time to plant their crops. George was only a boy of 16, but the farmers trusted him. They knew George was very smart and honest. "He will do a perfect job," one farmer said to another. I think gaining the trust of the farmers helped George Washington get ready for the job as president. Many people knew they could trust him. Give it a thumbs up if you think it's important for us to be able to trust the president. George's big brother Lawrence took him on a surveying trip in the Virginia wilderness. They stayed many cold and rainy days and nights. There were many wild animals. George learned how to take care of himself in the woods. Living in the wilderness helped George to become an even greater leader. When he was only 20 years old, he became a major in the Virginia Army. In 1754, a war broke out. French settlers and Native Americans in the Ohio Valley would not let the English settlers have farms there. George Washington was called to help the English settlers. He was now Colonel Washington. He led the English soldiers, and they won the war. Everyone looked up to Colonel Washington. One day, George met a lovely lady named Martha Custis. She was a widow with 2 children. They fell in love and were married in 1759. George and Martha Washington moved into a beautiful mansion in Mount Vernon, Virginia. They had many parties, laughter, and fun in their home. But Colonel Washington was soon called to war again. It was 1775. America was a very small country with only 13 colonies then. During this time, England ruled America. The rulers in England were mistreating America. They wanted America to pay unfair taxes. A war broke out. The Americans chose George Washington as their leader. The war lasted 8 years. The colonel was now General George Washington. Through his leadership, the American colonies won the war. America was no longer ruled by England. The colonies became the United States of America. The United States of America was under the leadership of General George Washington. He led the people to win the war. How do you think people felt about George Washington after that? Americans were very happy, but the new little country needed a leader. Everyone in the land wanted one and only one man for this job. General George Washington. So they made him the first president of the United States of America on April 30th, 1789. So the people made George Washington our very first president. He was the first leader of our country. On the day of his inauguration, President George Washington rode on a beautiful white horse on his way to the ceremony. Hooray! People cheered when President Washington stood before them to give his speech. Some people cried with joy. President Washington was a great president. He traveled all over America to see what the country needed. He passed good laws to help America. George Washington was president for 8 years. Afterwards, he went back to his home in Mount Vernon. He enjoyed good times and laughter again with Martha, his family, and friends. Americans will never forget the first president of their land. All right, guys, right here, I have a sentence. It says, President Washington was a great president. That's a good sentence, right? Okay, so right here, underneath this part, let's do a red line. This is our subject, President Washington, and it tells us who our sentence is all about, right? President Washington. And then the next part, was a great president, is our predicate, and it describes him. It tells about our subject, President Washington, right? So there are other ways that we could describe or talk about President Washington, right? So we could start with our sentence, President Washington was, and I've came up with 2 other things. First one was a surveyor. Oh, that's got an extra R in it. Whoops. First one is a surveyor, okay? And a surveyor, remember, is someone who measures land. And he was before he was president, wasn't he? And then the next one was a leader. President Washington was a leader, okay? And those are other things that we could use to fill in other things that President Washington was. We can change the predicate just a little bit. Now let's look at this page. I have 3 different parts of the sentence, and we've got to figure out how they go together, okay? So the first part, this purple one says, liked to read. The green one says, George. And the blue one says, and write. So we want to put them together so that our sentence makes sense, okay? So we need a subject first that's going to tell us who or what the sentence is mainly about. So is liked to read a good subject? Is that telling us who or what the sentence is about? No. What about George? Could George be a subject? It could, right? That tells us who the sentence is about. Our sentence is about George, okay? Now we need to find what the subject did. We know sometimes there can be 2 parts of the predicate. So I'm going to read you the other 2 sentence parts because there are 2 parts in this predicate. So we've got to figure out how we can link them together. We know our subject is George. This part says, and write, the blue part. And the purple part says, like to read. Now we want to fit them together. So we know that the word and is what we usually use to link 2 parts of a predicate. So that's going to be our second part because it's linking it together. So now our sentence says George liked to read and write. And that's a good sentence. We've got a subject, and we've got a predicate that's linked together with the word and. It starts with a capital, but what am I missing right here? A period. We need a period, and that's just a dot. All right, now you're going to go to Seesaw, and I want you to draw a picture showing what you liked best about George Washington as a leader. You're going to write underneath your picture. You're going to go ahead and think about the sentence you want to write now. You're going to find the sounds in each word and write them down. You're going to start with the sentence that's going to be written down. It says, George Washington was a good leader because. Then you're going to count the words that finish that sentence, and you're going to go word for word. You, not your grown-up, are going to find the sounds in each word, and you're going to write them down. Just do the best that you can.